Hi there. In many cultures and polytheistic religions, at least, death is worshipped, and there is a lord of death usually ascribed to the natural process. For example, in Hinduism, you have Yama and Yami, the god and goddess of death. So many ancient polytheistic systems, of course, you have the worship of death, and there are still some death cults. And of course, some people have described Christianity as a death cult, although it's more of a cult of resurrection rather than actual worship of death. But certainly in some South American countries and in Mexico in particular, there is a cult of death, and which name I shan't refer to in this video. And the reason why I bring this up is because there was this. I watched this stupid movie called Bad Boys Forever. And the only villain that they could find that was any interest to us was a couple of villains who were members of a death cult in Mexico, and they're also members of a criminal cartel, gangsters, and she was supposed to be a witch. So, obviously, this religion has been pilloried by the directors of this movie simply because they couldn't find anyone else to moan about. But I suppose it's all the rage to moan about Mexicans and gangsters coming from Mexico to invade the USA so after Donald Trump. So this film was made in 2019 and released last year. So it got me thinking about death cults. And I was going to call this video "Why Worship Death?" But here are five statutes in connection with a possible death cult or worship of actual death itself. And the first one I've got here is that death is observably, probably spelled that wrong, a power greater than oneself, a higher power, as spoken of by theologians and theists. So often people say that you should refer your life to a higher power, and death is obviously, observably, a higher power in the sense that it is the great leveler, and the proud and the lowly are brought down by death. And so, therefore, you don't have to actually have faith that death exists. You can see very well that death exists. Although one could add here that death is something which is a phenomenon which is observed by people who are not dead, rather than people who are dead, because we don't know, obviously, what death is like for those who have died, if they have survived in any sense after death. But even if they have survived after death, surely they have to acknowledge the reality of death as being a higher power than anything that they observed during their lifetimes, and continues to be so in relation to the fact that death is a portal, perhaps, for some kind of continuation of life. Of course, you should note, though, that in Christianity, there is no soul and there is no life after death. You merely sleep in the grave until the last trump, when the dead are awakened by the return of Christ. So, your great aunt isn't in heaven now. She must wait billions and billions of years until there is bodily resurrection as a result of the return of Christ and after the great judgment of God. So a lot of people don't actually understand that about Christianity. It doesn't have psychism at its heart. It doesn't have ghosts and people winging their way up to heaven after they have died. They do not do that. technically, until after the second coming. A long time after the second coming, indeed, for lots of things happen between the second coming and the actual final bodily resurrection. And so, but talking about Christianity, from the Christian point of view, of course, death is deserving because of Adam's sin. We are deserving of death. Death arises out of the sin of Adam and his disobedience to God. So, death in that sense is righteous, uh, theologically speaking. But it's also righteous in a broader sense of the word, in the sense that it is natural and it is inevitable. And also, it's good to let go of life and allow other people to live who might come after you, as it were, directly or indirectly. So the idea of righteousness I've taken here in the broader sense of the word. It's curious here, I say, ought not to be fearful of death, as almost is as if being fearful of death is some kind of source of immorality, indeed. And there is a sense of this in literature, of course, in H.P. Lovecraft and A.J. Rawlings. The central villains in A.J. Rawlings' story, of course, Voldemort, and I think it's Mr. Cousins, in H.P. Lovecraft's short story. They're people that try to cheat death, but the only way they can cheat death is by, harvesting organs from other people or taking life force from other people or doing unspeakably immoral and horrible things to other people in order to maintain themselves in a semblance of life. So they wish to cheat death, and the only way they can do that is through immoral means. And you could say that stem cell research is immoral, and you could say that all the research ultimately to bring about a prolongation of life, and perhaps even making life or creating some kind of semblance of immortality, either through the application of AI or the application of some kind of stem cell technology, is sort of based on immorality. Whereas if one accepts death and is not fearful of it, and accepts righteousness of death, then this is almost a good thing. So it's almost that we ought not to not accept death, as it were, using double negatives there. Now the other thing, the third point to make here, of course, is that death comes. Death comes at and as the end of suffering. So surely, yes, death is the end of suffering on many levels. It also comes as the end of suffering and at the end of suffering. But even in the face of death, I've said here that we might as well be kind to each other as not. And this is a sort of statement that I've made elsewhere, that kindness and cultivating loving kindness, it almost seems sort of logical in the face that life is full of suffering with death at the end of it, and that kindness arises in the face of such suffering and of death. Of course, death is a liberation of sorts, and yet we ought not to kill other things willfully, and we ought to preserve life as well. So it sort of, you might think rather contradictorily, there is an idea of preserving life and an instruction not to take life willfully and for no reason on the other side of that. So the idea of kindness is non-harm on one hand, and preservation, the idea of preservation on the other. And then, of course, we come to the fact that thinking about death and contemplating it is that death is no separation from the elements that gave us life. So earth, fire, air, and water. These are the basic elements, the building blocks of life. And it seems to me that death is no separation from these, and indeed no separation from Gaia, or the Earth life force, or from the planet itself. We don't go anywhere. We become one with the elements, admittedly one with the so-called blind forces of the universe, but one nevertheless. So we achieve oneness in the broadest sense of the word, or even narrowest sense of the word. If you choose to not be, if you choose to criticise my statutes on the basis that I'm only looking at this materially, but I'm looking at it existentially as well, and it is a fact that in death we are as one with all things that gave us life in the first place, which I find is some comfort, and to contemplate that could be a source of comfort in the face of death. Even though apparently we should not seek comfort in the face of death, we should not fear death because death is righteous. And then finally, it, it, life, the objective of life is to prepare to die, preparation of death. We need to die well. We need to die consciously. There is a very, very beautiful passage in the Mahabharata about when one of the heroes, he knows that he is going to be assassinated, and so he does pranayama, which is breath awareness, and he's observed to go into deep meditation and deep control of his breath, to the point where he dies technically. And the last breath is seen to leave the top of his head, through the crown chakra, as a result of his meditation and calmness and peacefulness in the face of death. And then the assassin comes in and cuts his head off, but he is actually already dead before the assassin murders him. So in fact, no death has occurred. Perhaps mirroring the fact that that the soul cannot be killed. But in any case, it seems to me that to use meditation and pranayama to prepare oneself for one's final breath is a beautiful way to live, in fact, and a sensible way to live. And I know in the USA and in the West generally, death is seen as a failure, and death is feared, and death is kind of swept away under the carpet, and it seems to me that death almost goes against the American dream, because you can't gain any more material money and power if you're dead. So death is almost like a stigma, really, in the West, whereas in other cultures, death is accepted, especially, of course, in Buddhist cultures, where death is seen as a liberation from the sufferings of this world, which indeed, objectively, it is. So, I always going to put here, the worship of death requires not faith but preparation, and the worship of the god of death is something that is about a preparation to die rather than a clinging on to life. And you certainly don't need faith in the sense that death is everywhere. In the midst of life we are in death, so you can see the work of the Lord of Death and the Goddess of Death every day. How many people are buried every minute of every day, millions upon millions, obviously, around the world. And so death is inevitable. And I think people used to be more accepting of death than they are now. When you think about infant death, infant mortality was so high, even, I don't know, 60 years ago, and in some parts of the world it is still very high. And so people are forced, I suppose, to accept death and accept that many of their children will die before the age of 5. And we, obviously, in the West, we are shocked by that. And in a sense, maybe we should be shocked, and we are obliged to prevent death wherever we can find, whether we can find it when if it's practical to prevent death, we should prevent it on one hand, and yet we should also accept it on the other. So there's a sort of contradiction there at work there. And But the worship of death, surely it's, and I think a lot of people think that death cults are about killing. But I think, the worship of death has nothing to do with killing or predatory cults as such. The worship of death is worshipping the fact of death, rather than adding to it through willful killing or taking of other life through predatory means. So I don't think really that it's fair to sort of make out that death cults are evil, in that sense, because they're not about killing. They're just about worshipping the god of death, and death is so natural, and death is so righteous, but some of the concepts here, like the objective of life is to prepare to die, it may seem outlandish to you. They may seem ghoulish or negative, but I don't see how you can say that, because I mean, the death is necessary for life to continue in one form or another. And I did say in this world, death is observably a higher power, and I added that caveat because, of course, the Gnostics seek liberation from this world. And of course, Christians look forward to a time when there will be a new earth, as it were, but in which death will no longer happen or no longer occur. So, in that sense, in the Christian sense and the Gnostic sense, death is part of this world. And yet, also, it is worthy of worship. It is worthy of witnessing to the natural power of death and the inevitability of death, as I've discussed.